Well, hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Raj Kumar. I'm the president and editor-in-chief of DevX. I want to give you a warm welcome wherever you are joining us from around the world. I know many of you are at kitchen tables, and that's a really very appropriate place to be if you are at your kitchen table today, having this conversation, because we're talking about farmers and food. We are here to have a spotlight on climate as a key issue, of course, that we all know is an underlying crisis happening in the world today. But at a moment when another crisis is dominating the headlines, the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, DevX and IFAD have gotten together to put together a series of virtual events to ensure we are focusing on where one of the most important issues in the world is today, and that is smallholder farmers in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, and elsewhere. And so we're delighted to have you here and delighted to be partnering with IFAD. We have an incredible lineup of speakers and experts from around the world who are going to be joining the conversation today, including all of you who are following along. We want to hear from you. There's a chance to submit your questions, to answer poll questions that we're going to have during the course of our conversation today. If you haven't been a part of it, check out the DevX and IFAD Twitter streams. Yesterday, we had a whole conversation, a Twitter town hall. Some 25 organizations from around the world were a part of it. We heard, for example, from UNDP Climate, talking about the opportunity to use innovative business models in agricultural finance. They talked about how in Bangladesh, there's a solar irrigation pump project, which is integrating private sector business models right in its design to make sure it's financially sustainable. So lots of ideas and input like that from all over the world. We welcome you to take a look at that as we get into the discussion today. And just to frame up what we're here to talk about, when you hear climate crisis, if you're like me, the imagery that may come to mind are icebergs melting, or storms, wildfires, natural disasters of all kinds. Well, we want to put another image when you think of climate and you think of the climate crisis, and that's a woman farmer in her small field, maybe in Asia, maybe in Africa, maybe in Latin America. Because when you think of who is on the front lines of this climate crisis, it is smallholder farmers. And we're going to hear more about why that is the case, what that means for all of us, and also what the opportunities are to do something about it. We've got, as I say, an incredible group. I want to welcome first my friend David Nabarro. And David, you can go ahead and turn on your camera and unmute yourself if you like. David is someone I think we all know from his long career at the forefront of these very issues we're talking about today. He has led, among other things, the Ebola response at the UN, many years at the UN, before that at DFID. And at the moment, he is one of the senior advisors to the Director General of the World Health Organization dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. So he is a very busy man. And we appreciate you taking some time, David, to be with all of us today to talk about an issue you know well as a winner of the World Food Prize and an issue you worked so much in for many years. So maybe you can just begin by helping us connect the dots between the climate, the pandemic crisis we all face right now, and smallholder farmers. How are these things actually connected? And welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, Raj. Hello, everybody. It's nice to be connected, and it's really good to be participating with a brilliant panel in this event jointly organized by DevX and IFAD. One of the things that I noticed as the COVID pandemic advanced across the world in the months of this year was just how massive the impact has been on issues related to food and nutrition in so many different countries. The first thing is that in order to try to stop the virus from causing enormous outbreaks, many governments imposed movement restrictions on their people. And that meant staying at home and not moving around. But for people who don't have big money in their pockets, who depend on daily wages, to be told that you've got to stay at home is a really miserable situation because they don't have savings, they also don't have a lot of spare food in their homes. And so what happened during the period May, June into July was that something in the region of about half the world's population was living under movement restrictions. Sometimes these are called lockdowns.
That's an amazing statistic. Half of the people in the world at the same time told not to leave their home.
And it very quickly became clear that this was having an enormous impact on poor people, not just the adults who were going hungry, the children going hungry and not being able to access nutritious food. We don't have the statistics, but many people have told us that these months have led to a real rise in levels of acute and chronic undernutrition among children, and also real hunger among adults. And actually, this is going on still, Raj, because the pandemic is very much with us. In fact, the numbers of reported cases are higher than ever right now. And we're seeing the same phenomenon, because more and more countries are using movement restrictions, and that does lead to income poverty, food poverty, and the risk of malnutrition. In addition, during the period of movement restrictions, people also buy less. They buy less luxury foods, they buy less dairy, they buy less vegetables. And what that then has meant is that farmers who are selling perishable goods are not able to get their goods bought in markets. And that in turn means that they don't have income. And that leads to increased indebtedness and also challenges with the next planting cycle. So it's been a big hit for smallholder farmers in many parts of the world. And then thirdly, the supply chains stop working because of border restrictions, and that means that food doesn't move around. And then lastly, just to add in, there's been a particular phenomenon, which is COVID has revealed the problems faced by migrant workers and workers in food processing. They seem to be paid very little money, and they've had to work under really difficult conditions. And there's been big COVID outbreaks in certain kinds of food processing plants. Altogether, what's COVID done? It showed us that our food systems, from the farmer through to the consumption point, are really very fragile. And it's also shown some big vulnerabilities. And that's why I think, yeah.
Take that as the backdrop, and now think about the fact that there's a climate crisis happening as well underneath all this. If you're a smallholder farmer, we're going to have a representative in East Africa joining us soon. If you're a smallholder farmer in East Africa, let's say, yes, you're dealing with major environmental and climate shifts happening at the same time as you have this pandemic. Help us think through what this is like for a farmer. What are they trying to do? And what should the global community be thinking about this huge population of people we all rely on?
Well, I've been able to hear representatives of farmer organizations from three big continents during the last few months, and they've all told me the same story. Farmers are already struggling with the impacts of climate change, affecting water, making it saline, affecting land because it's just not receiving the moisture it needs for being able to grow. And so land that was arable turning into desert, affecting also the atmosphere. We've definitely got signs that there are so many factors, not necessarily directly linked to climate, which are actually making the environment difficult. For example, polluted air as a result of burning and so on. If we take all these issues together, environmental and climate challenges are affecting hundreds of millions of smallholder farmers as we speak, and making it really hard for them to be able to earn a living. When you combine that with the COVID effects, it's a huge hit for this community of people on whom we all depend. And the real challenge, if you are in the poor group, is that it's quite hard for others to see just how much you're hurting. Because if you can't get food and you can't get cash and you can't get your children to school and so on. Basically, your poverty is a silent poverty, and it's a distressing poverty, probably reflects in actually the child being less well able to do in school and the adults being less able to deal with common illnesses. But when people get poorer in this way, it's often undetected. And so I think the world is not conscious that there have been hundreds of millions of people made poor, made hungry, affected by problems in food systems during the last few months. And I believe this is a massive global problem.
Well, I want to thank you, David, for taking the time to help set the stage for us in this discussion. And you're so right. You know, if the story of this period is going to be written, one big part of it will be the backsliding on the SDGs. I see your pin and your clock.
Right.
We will be backsliding, sadly, on the SDGs, including for smallholder farmers.
Right.
But the other half of the story is yet to be written, and that is, what do we do about it? And that's a lot of what we're here to talk about. And I want to thank you for getting us started in that vein.
Well, I hope you let me just say one thing, and I'll be super quick.
Please.
Because I've also been worried that the resources that are needed to deal with this problem are just not moving into the system. Many people working in the non-governmental sector, particularly local NGOs, tell me they just can't get cash, so they can't respond to hunger. And people working with smallholders say they're not getting the resources they need to support smallholders through indebtedness. And that's why I'm really pleased that IFAD is sponsoring this event, because as they come into their 12th replenishment, gosh, I hope that that wonderful organization that works for smallholder farmers will get the backing it needs. Thanks so much, Raj.
Thank you, David. I very much appreciate it. And we are going to go a little bit deeper on this issue. And we have actually some new information, some new data to share with all of you. Dr. Barbara Buckner is with us. And Barbara, I invite you to turn on your camera as well. Barbara is the Global Managing Director of the Climate Policy Initiative and also the Executive Director of its well-known Climate Finance Program. She's been named one of the 100 most influential people in climate policy, one of the 20 most influential women in climate change. This is an issue she works on every day, and has actually, her institute in collaboration with IFAD has put together a report which I think for the first time looks very carefully at the issue of climate finance and how it connects and ultimately comes down to the smallholder farmer, or maybe doesn't come down to the smallholder farmer. And Barbara, we'd love to hear what you found. What's the data you're going to be revealing in this session today?
Thank you so much again, Raj, for having me here. And thanks so much for David actually setting the scene, and I think making the study that we are launching today even more important. So again, I'm pleased to be here today to help launch our report with IFAD, which is titled Examining the Climate Finance Gap for Small-Scale Agriculture. What the report is doing is really providing the first of its kind insights into the levels of climate finance flowing towards small-scale agriculture in developing countries. And these insights were based on the latest data that is available from our global landscape of climate finance database. And it's the latest data that's available on international financial commitments in 2017 and in 2018. And again, I hope that we can give a little bit more flavor to what the issues that actually David has been raising in his scene setting remarks. Just as a little background for the purpose of this study, we adopted a pretty broad definition of what we mean by small-scale climate finance. So we are including financial commitments for projects benefiting not only small-scale producers, whether they hold land titles or not, but also cooperatives, agribusinesses, as well as households. So let me maybe just start with our key finding, which is that less than 2% of global climate finance goes to small-scale farmers in developing nations, despite their vulnerability to worsening extreme weather and their crucial role in feeding billions of people. Less than 2%. Our analysis shows that climate finance for small-scale agriculture reached nearly $10 billion per year in 2017 and 2018, and that represents approximately 1.7%, so less than 2% of the total climate finance tracked. And again, if we had the slides, then you would see that out of the big picture, that it's really kind of a very, very small piece of the overall pie. If we dig further into these numbers, we see that the vast majority of these funds are channeled through the sectors of agriculture, forestry, and land use and natural resource management, while lower additional benefits are reaching small-scale agriculture through renewable energy generation, but also through sustainable transport in rural areas and water management. And while the exact volume of funding needed for small-scale agriculture climate finance is very hard to determine, we know that the total financial needs of small-scale farmers and agri-enterprises are in the order of hundreds of billions annually. And therefore, obviously, the figures that we calculated indicate that the current financing level is insufficient to ensure the climate resilience of small-scale agriculture actors to mitigate the effects of climate change on agriculture. And actually, so again, and that was, again, making clear that was before the pandemic. So we're talking about 2017 and 2018 figures. So we are obviously expecting that figures might even worsen going forward. And just a little bit more on what are some of our findings in terms of the data we have, but also where we see that the most important financial flows going into this area. Our analysis relies on the data sets that are collected from various sources, which kept their mainly international public financial flows. But we know that the most significant data gaps exist for public domestic financial flows. And again, we also know that there's data gaps for domestic and international finance flows from the private sector, including from corporates, philanthropies, and commercial financial institutions. But again, I think I want to really make this point here that domestic actors, both public and private, are by far the highest investors in agriculture in low and middle income countries. So they're overtaking both the official development assistance and the foreign direct investment. And this really indicates that domestic finance offers the greatest opportunity for greening financial flows to agriculture. But again, the lack from domestic level data of both public and private finance really prevents us from determining that the full scale of climate finance flows originating from farmer households and governments, again, which we think could be of considerable size. So let me just move on and kind of highlight a few of the recommendations that we draw in our study here. And I think the first one is really that we see that climate finance can play an instrumental role in increasing prosperity and climate resilience for the world's most vulnerable populations, especially in this time. To tackle the main issues identified in our report, we have a number of specific recommendations for public and private and for international and domestic actors. And again, let me just provide a very quick overview of those before handing back to you, Raj. So the first of the two recommendations I want to delve into is that we need to channel climate finance to small-scale agriculture at scale. I think here collaboration between the public and the private sectors to mitigate the risks associated with investments in agricultural sectors should be enhanced. And you already talked about some of the findings from yesterday's webinar. And we see that really, for example, blended finance instruments, but also subsidies, fiscal transfers, these all represent an opportunity to step up the support for small-scale agriculture and build back rural economies sustainably amidst the current economic recession. We also see that international and domestic climate finance flows should stimulate the transition of agribusiness and finance service providers towards low emission supply chains. And again, also David has talked about the supply chains already. We really see that agribusinesses and finance institutions play an essential role in supporting small scale producers and linking them to markets. And our second recommendation, which I want to share with you today, is that these actors must collect more comprehensive data on climate finance that focuses on small-scale agriculture. And this is crucial because information on trends, on investment gaps, and on opportunities would really shed light on practical actions that governments, development finance institutions, but also climate funds and private investors and businesses can take. So in this report, we suggest building consistent and standardized tools, as well as additional modalities for data collection. And we also emphasize that ministries of finance and national treasuries in developing countries should increasingly require all government ministries and agencies to regularly report on their climate-related investments in this sector, really to keep a detailed check on progress. So maybe let me just stop here, Raj. These were some of the highlights of our report with IFAD, which is now available on my organization on CPI's website. There is a link. I'm sure that we can share the link in the chat box with all of the audience so we can make sure that they know where to download it. But again, thanks so much for the great collaboration with IFAD and with you for this webinar here. And thanks for making me part of this important dialogue today. And back to you.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you for adding some data to the discussion, right? And as you say, we at Devex have actually done quite a bit of reporting on climate finance. It's a squishy term, even in and of itself. It's a bit hard to pin down what it means. And then it's even harder to do what you've done, which is to then follow that money flow and try to figure out how much actually gets to the people who you would think are at the very forefront of an issue like this, smallholder farmers. As you say, 2% or less is the real headline number. And then that, I hope for all of us, is a call to action that, you know, it's not just about getting them a higher percentage of this money, but making them the center of the issue so we can actually address this crisis that's emerging all over the world. I want to thank you, Barbara, and I want to welcome the panel that we have with us today to join the conversation so we can dig just a little bit deeper past those numbers. Meike van Ginneken is with us from IFAD, Ruth Onyango, Michelle Winthrop. Please go ahead and turn on your cameras and we will begin our conversation if you don't mind. Welcome, everyone. So let me just mention, I think we're waiting for Michelle to get her camera on if she can. There you are. Nice to see you, Michelle. Michelle is the Director of Policy at Irish Aid, part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Ireland. We also have, as I mentioned, Ruth Onyango, who is the founder and leader of the Rural Outreach Program and editor-in-chief of the Africa Journal of Food, Nutrition, and Development, based in Kenya. And we have Meike van Ginneken, who is the Associate Vice President for Knowledge Management at IFAD and has had a long career on these issues, including as fairly recently the CEO of SNV in the Netherlands. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for being part of this today. Ruth, maybe I can begin with you. You have been a leader on these issues. You are the founder and editor-in-chief of this publication. Spend time with rural smallholder farmers. Can you bring their voice into this for us? What is it like now to be a smallholder farmer facing the climate crisis today?
First of all, Raj, thank you so much for inviting me to be here, and also to thank David. I'm happy to see him. Just to tell you that last time I was with David on the same panel was in 2018 in Kigali, and I cried tears. And actually, I cried. I broke down because I was talking about child hunger. You know, talking about a child who is hungry and saying, have you ever felt hunger? As an adult, maybe you have. And how about children, you know? And yes, I've spent quite a bit of my time working with the smallholder farmers, and I know it's always like, it's like a cliche all these years. You know, you talk about smallholder farmers and you know, the G8 or some conference comes and there's commitment. And Ruth, are you happy now? All this money is going to go to smallholder farmers, you know, but I'm on the ground. I'm on the ground. I'm the chair of Sasakawa Africa Association. I go to about 6 African countries. You know, I sit on the CABI board, you know. So I go to some of these countries and I see smallholder farmers. And when I reach there, I don't see any of that money that was promised to them. So that has been the case. But now comes Corona, and I'm sitting in the house, I haven't gone anywhere, and I'm watching even the TV, and Raj, I'm shocked. In Kenya, in East Africa, it was the fall armyworm. We haven't even sorted that one out. Before Corona, then we had the locust, and you know, locusts come and they eat anything green in their way. We didn't even sort that one out yet. And then floods come and they actually submerge schools, 2,000 children out, you know, wildlife, farms, no farming. These are smallholder farmers. This is during Corona. Then Corona comes and our countries say, just like Spain and Europe and Italy, we are locking down. You know, whom are you locking down? Families of 12, you are telling them stay inside in one room what happens? So really, unfortunately, we have Corona with these severe impacts, but at the same time, it seems like the climate negative impacts are also coming at the same time. And it's mostly those smallholder farmers that will suffer. They'll not go away. We depend on them. Things have eased a little bit, but I believe we can still do a lot more. And we have to continue singing this song. And I'm happy that you decided to actually focus on this. And I've gone through quickly the IFAD report. I see their focus, and I just hope that we can rally more support and we can rally more finance, and we can actually now say, let it reach where it needs to reach. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. And it's worth noting, it's not as though the world was supporting smallholder farmers all along, and then came this crisis and we're not doing enough. Really, these are farmers who have been overlooked forever. And one little statistic that I think helps to, at least for me, underline that is the tractor. The year the tractor was invented was 1892. And in places like where I live here in the United States, if you're a household with a small lawn, you own a tractor to just trim your own grass. And that's the case. It's not a luxury item anymore for much of the world. But I think the statistic in sub-Saharan Africa, as you and I and many others have seen with our own eyes, is something like 60% of farmers don't have access to a tractor. And as a result are in a situation where they have to plant the field using manual labor, 40 days of backbreaking labor to prepare a field for planting, 8 hours with a tractor. So these are communities that have been overlooked for a long, long time. And now comes the climate crisis on top of that. And I want to make you into the conversation to ask, we're hearing this report, stunning figures, only 2% or less of climate finance actually gets to these farmers. How do you think about the opportunity here? We're hearing the challenge, but how do you think about the opportunity to put the farmer at the center of their own chance to kind of lift themselves out of this if we just listen to what their needs are and bring them into the process? How do you see that at IFAD?
Thanks very much, Raj. And your story about tractors reminds me when I lived in the Central African Republic a few years ago. There were 2 tractors in the whole country, a red one and a green one. And the president would like to get on the picture with him. That has gone up since, but does this COVID crisis mean that we stop that progress? I also just wanted to make a point. The finding that Barbara presented, that only 2% of climate finance goes to smallholder farmers, is really shocking. But I don't think we should see this as a zero-sum game. It shouldn't go up as a percentage, it should go up in absolute numbers. Energy attracts 20 times more climate finance than agriculture. That doesn't mean energy needs less, it means agriculture needs more. Let me talk a little bit about what IFAD does to target our financing to smallholder farmers, and also what we do to leverage others to do the same and to overcome the barriers that Barbara just outlined. IFAD invests in rural people, and we're very good and very dedicated at targeting our financing. We really think in all of our projects, where is this going? How do we reach the last mile? How do we reach women? How do we reach youth? How do we reach indigenous people? And I think that focus and doing this explicitly and in every single project is very important. I also think that means that you have to go to the most difficult places, remote areas, rural areas. Don't stop at the capital or the zones next to the capital. Really take fragile situations, conflict situations, go to where the poor are.
And that's, in fact, if you look at, kind of a map of where development financing goes, not just for climate or agriculture, but in general, you see that problem in stark relief, that so much of the development assistance lands at the capital or right around the capital, and so much of the need is often far away. And that's the case in many, many countries in Asia and in Latin America and Africa.
Yeah, so I think all our financing of IFAD goes to government, and in the end, our project mix government finance with IFAD finance and finance of other donors. What does this mean? It means that government programs themselves become more targeted. And it also means that we build capacity by learning by doing. We're breaking down these barriers that Barbara introduced. Technical capacity, capacity to deal with procedures and standards, capacity to think about climate adaptation and to act on climate adaptation and mitigation, and the absorptive capacity of public financial systems. We also bring in private banks, agriculture banks, development banks, because it's not only public finance that's going to do this trick. And lastly, we build the capacity of small and medium enterprises themselves. There is no smallholder farmer in the world that doesn't want to be a big holder farmer. They want to grow. They want to not only feed their families. And our experience is that smallholder farmers are great entrepreneurs. So if you help them to increase productivity, you give them the financial tools, the technology tools, they will be able to absorb more financing. So IFAD has a wealth of experience in designing and implementing large projects that target thousands of small and medium enterprises. And I think that's where we come into the climate finance. It's hard to target so many small enterprises. And we've done this for decades. So we can offer other climate financiers to take this headache out of their hands. We need to use that experience because we're in a hurry. We need to address this urgently and we need to scale this up. We need to do this for thousands, for millions of people at the same time.
I appreciate that commentary, Meka, and it makes me think about the reality of the millions of people who are represented by that kind of last mile problem. And that if we don't solve that, and these are people living, as Ruth says, at the edge of poverty, living day to day, this is where you see climate change turn into a massive global humanitarian crisis overnight. If we don't build the resilience of these smallholders, appreciate the importance and the challenge of reaching so many people. I want to bring Michelle into the discussion as well. Michelle, IrishAid is, of course, a leading donor in the world. This is one of your areas of focus, smallholder farmers and global nutrition. How do you think about this? We've heard now the statistics. It's such a small percentage of climate finance that gets there. We've heard the challenge from Ruth. How are you thinking about, as a donor, addressing an issue like this today? What are some of the lessons you're taking away?
Sure. Thank you, Raj, and great to see you all. What a fantastic opportunity to really get under the bonnet of these issues. As you might imagine, we've been giving this quite a lot of thought of late. Some of the things that we're seeing that really seem to be working in terms of how donors can work better. One is really by taking a multi-stakeholder approach. We have the flexibility as donors not to exclusively work with government or exclusively work with civil society or exclusively research, but to work with the whole range. And I think smallholder farmers need the diversity of support that comes from those different stakeholders. It's important to note, I think, that the COVID-19 crisis has kind of reduced the space and the flexibility for a lot of civil society organisations. And I think that's beginning to bite with farmers too. No more than IFAD, Ireland has made a solemn commitment to reaching the furthest behind first in all of our work, and indeed to working on gender equality. When I think smallholder farmer, she is a woman in my head. But I think by doing that, it forces us to kind of understand some of the local power dynamics a bit better and understand some of the institutional issues. We're paying a lot of attention about how we can be effective at programming complex crises as well, because we haven't mentioned hunger that much. But if you follow the hunger, usually the hunger is happening in places where there's conflict or long-running crises. And really, agriculture is a great opportunity to demonstrate that so-called humanitarian development nexus, really just make it work for people. And then lastly, I think we're trying to be careful about this, but we're trying to find opportunities where we can replicate our own experience in the food sector. We have a good reputation in this space. We have convened a multi-stakeholder task force to really identify what Ireland can and cannot add, what's appropriate for us to replicate and share, and really what's not, what's unique to the Irish context. And we certainly hope to be doing that with a bit more oomph as we approach the Food Systems Summit, which I'm sure we'll come back to. Lastly, I suppose, given the uncertainty that the climate crisis and indeed the COVID crisis poses for smallholder farmers, an adaptive approach to programming is really, really important. And I think allowing partners to adjust and flex and shift priorities as they see reality changing on the ground is more important now than I think ever before.
Yeah, you mentioned especially the civil society organizations, small cooperatives, NGOs that are at the front lines of this and maybe right now suffering a big drawdown of their financial resources. And now might be the moment to ensure we're supporting them. I do want to tell the audience that we'd like to get your take on these themes. And we actually have a poll question. If our producer can put it up, we're going to give this a try. We just want to get your sense on the biggest challenges that smallholder farmers are facing today in low and middle income countries. We know there's a lot of expertise among our audience today, joining us from all over the world. Many of you work directly in these issues. And this is purposely a very hard question to answer, and because all of these could very well be the answer, but we'd like to at least highlight them for you and get your take. So if you can take a moment to answer that question, and then we will see the results. And as we do that, I'd like to continue the discussion if we can, and bring Ruth back into it. When you talk to farmers themselves, how would they answer a question like this? How do they experience it in their day-to-day lives? And what do you think they would want to say to an audience like the one that we have gathered today around the world? And producers, you can go ahead and show the results if we have them.
All right. We've moved from charity. There was a whole era, where people would give. They thought it was philanthropy, just giving. And I've worked with farmers in different situations, and I've seen them grow, and you go back, and there's nothing they are more proud of than showing you that they have been able to do it themselves. I'm able to purchase my seed, I'm able to feed my own family, it restores their integrity, so they feel good about it. It's not just being given, but rather being taught and holding their hand. And that's what extension workers used to do. In many of our African countries, we don't even have those extension workers anymore. We have left smallholder farmers unto themselves. You can read, some of them can't read. You can use your mobile phone. We have this app, and then we have an emerging group of smallholder farmers along the value chain. These are young people. And we in Kenya, we are trying to, interest young people into this sector. They don't have to go using a hoe and digging, but they can work within the sector doing different things, and also creating that link between them and the women farmers on the ground, so that these ones have produced, and you see how you move it forward, you add value, you link it to markets, you can use your mobile app, and you can do different things. It started very, very slowly, but it's sort of picking up. So the woman farmer on the ground will still tell you, you know what, I just need help. I need help. I need help. I need to be told when to plant. Weather variability, you plant, it doesn't germinate, or it does, it dries up, you have to plant again. It's very expensive right now. And that's where actually public sector comes in. And that's where governments really come in. And that's where we value the extension, public extension. You can have private extension, but public extension becomes critical to people in the rural areas, to farmers in the rural areas.
Yeah, and it looks like the people answering this poll question maybe have a similar view to you, Ruth. This idea that in the end, these are all connected issues, the negative impacts of climate change and unsustainable agricultural practices. But without financing, farmers can't build the kind of resilience that they need. Maybe the financing is used for solar energy. Maybe it's for solar energy to run an irrigation system, a water pump of some kind. Maybe it's to have resilience when there's a locust or some other pest, that they can have the financing to get new seed or to make it through a difficult period. It's that financing that is so essential, and the reason we wanted to focus on it today. Go ahead.
Yeah, and it's so confusing for them. But you know, Raj, this has been the same story over. But maybe during this COVID, we have time to think. We have time to reflect. We have time for more of us to want to do good, because many of us need to want to do good, to make a difference, to change this situation. Yeah.
Nikki, I would like to bring you back in the discussion if I can. Barbara made the point earlier that when she and her team were studying the numbers, it was really hard to get the domestic figures. You know, what are governments investing? And yet we know governments and private sector is a big part of it. You know, IFAD has an interesting role because you're helping to knit together so many other elements of this broader ecosystem. So how do you think of that broader ecosystem? Climate finance coming from multilateral organizations, international organizations, domestic financing, the private sector and their role. How do you think about this at IFAD and where you sit in terms of organizing this ecosystem to be most effective for smallholder farmers?
Yeah, thanks very much. And trying to figure out how much government spend is difficult, not only on climate, but on everything, no? And one thing is to look at the budget of governments, but we know that especially in Africa, a lot of these budgets are not being executed. So if something in the budget, that doesn't mean it's being spent. And money being spent doesn't mean that it reaches the local government, that it reaches the smallholder farmer. I do think we also have to realize that agriculture in the end is mostly a private business. And I cannot underline enough the role that governments need to play, and especially in these crises that they need to finance. So I think we need to look at this ecosystem and make it work together. We need to make sure that when we think about the private sector, we include everything, including the informal private sector. When you talk about the private sector, we all think about Coca-Cola and Unilever, but the real private sector in Africa is the smallholder farmer. And as Michelle said, I think of a woman when I hear about smallholder farmers. The role of governments need to be focused on public goods. And I also don't want to let donors get off the hook here. Climate adaptation, if we talk about climate, the people who suffer the most and who have the least resilience to deal with it are the people who didn't cause this. So yes, this needs to come from domestic governments. Yes, it needs to come from the private sector, but it also needs to come from donors. And that led me to my last point. And that's one of the problems of climate finance, is that a lot of it is loans and on pretty commercial terms. So I think if we think about climate finance, reaching smallholder farmers, we also need to look at the financial terms of that finance. It needs to be grants or it needs to be highly concessional. And we need to help, and in IFAD we do this, smallholder farms to start with grant financing and to grow towards more commercial financing, because that's the only way that in the long term they will run a sustainable business. They are entrepreneurs. They will be able to run this business themselves, but we just need to prime the pump and give them the investment money to actually start that business. And that's only more difficult in the case of a changing climate, where they need to invest more in water, in solar energy, and in other services, so they can run their business resiliently and do not get sidelined by shocks, whether it's a pandemic, a drought, or a flood.
So many really interesting points that I wish I could follow all up on because we're running out of time, Mika. But just to say, I'm so glad you made the point that often you need to begin with grants to get to a sustainable model. You can't just begin with loans on commercial terms for people who are living below the poverty line. And I think there's some excitement, understandable excitement around fintech and around innovative finance and development. But we do have to remember there is a role for grant financing in order to get people to the stage at which they can be able to take on credit and reliably and sustainably pay it back. So thank you for bringing that to the conversation. Michelle, as we're running out of time here, we've had many interesting questions come in. We've addressed most of them, I think, in your comments, but one is just the fundamental question of why isn't more climate finance making its way to the smallholder farmer? And I wonder if you could help us address that as we close out the panel.
It's a good question. I mean, I think you know, I've spent some time in my life in the thorny world of climate negotiations, and I think that has perhaps become a little disjointed from reality. It's not, discussions at that level, at COPs and so on, are not rooted in sectors, and they're not rooted in human impact. And I think that is what has taken over. I think also Barbara mentioned before perceived risks about resources flowing to the local level and resources going to the, you know, the end of the road and places nobody's heard of. And really we have to pull together, I think, on those perceived risks. I know that the least developed countries, for example, have launched an initiative to try and get to the bottom of those risks and almost like build the pipes through which we can pour the money to get to local levels. I think that's really, really important too. But really, I mean, you mentioned David's pin and his clock earlier on. We need to bring the challenge of global climate action together with the Sustainable Development Goals. And we need to have those goals in all of our conversations. They are not two separate conversations. This is one challenge. And really, I probably would leave you with that message. Let's not forget the SDGs, and let's really try to deliver on them and use climate finance towards that end.
Well, I want to thank you. I want to thank Mieke van Ginneken. I want to thank Ruth Onyango, Michelle Winthrop. Thank you all for a fantastic conversation. It went very quick. There's a lot more I would have loved to ask all of you, but thank you for being a part of this. Thanks to the whole audience as well. I know we're giving you virtual applause all over the world. If we were in person, you would hear that warm applause. We have one more one-on-one conversation coming, but before we get there, we're going to hear directly from two IFAD country directors to get a sense for what's really happening on the ground in two different regions of the world. I'm going to ask our producers if the technology will work with us to show those videos now.
Hi, my name is Anne Turinayo, and I'm the IFAD Country Director for Burkina Faso and Sierra Leone. In West Africa in general, farmers are at the front line of climate change. They grapple with the realities of deciding when to plant and when not to plant because of the irregular rainfall, too much sunshine, and such issues that have arisen because of climate change. Here in Burkina Faso, they have only 4 months of rainfall strictly throughout the year. So the IFAD and the government have worked together to come up with a project that is supporting farmers to regulate water for agriculture. For instance, behind me for the rice garden, they have built some canals and bridges with the help of the farmers to regulate water so that the rice can grow nicely. Also, the project is supporting some of the farmers to extract underground water so that it can be utilized to support the vegetable production during the off-rain season.
Hi, I'm Tawfiq Al-Zabri. I'm Country Director at IFAD for the Pacific Islands. Pacific Island countries are among the most vulnerable to climate change and to natural disasters. Tropical cyclone severity and frequency is increasing, as are drought, and rainfall patterns are irregular. Sea level rise is leading to saltwater intrusion into underground water and increasing soil salinity. IFAD is assisting rural communities to prepare climate-smart community development plans and to adopt more climate-resilient agricultural practices, as well as increase the efficiency of natural resource use. IFAD is helping farmers organize and have better access to markets so that their higher revenues can help them cope with the risks. This support also leads to availability of nutritious local food for a healthy diet. But rural communities are also facing COVID-19, making them even more isolated. This is the time to stand with them. We cannot leave them behind.
Well, it was great to hear these voices from IFAD country directors, and I think it helps to ground the conversation that we've had today. I want to welcome Kamal Kera to the discussion. Kamal, welcome. Thank you for being a part of this. You're the permanent secretary to the Minister for International Development in Canada. Really, thank you for being here. And I just want to ask you, you've heard the conversation so far. What is Canada doing when you think about the challenges facing smallholder farmers in low and middle income countries? What is Canada's approach?
Well, thank you, Raj, for first and foremost for for this really enriching conversation. I really want to thank Devex and IFAD for inviting me to this event. And I think at the time where most of our gatherings are virtual, I think I truly appreciated listening to the frontline farmers that we just heard in the video. So thank you for that. Look, Raj, we know this pandemic has been devastating, especially for the world's poorest rural poorest. The World Bank's recent forecast that the economic consequences could push as many as 150 million people into extreme poverty is extremely worrisome, to say the least. It is more critical than ever that we maintain momentum on climate action given the economic and environmental challenges that farmers face today. Donors need to support the efforts for developing countries to build a rural resilience, as we've heard, to all manner of external shocks, from extreme weather to economic downturns to the impact of diseases. All countries, including Canada, rely on healthy, resilient, and productive rural areas where people can earn good livelihoods. So Canada's commitment to climate action has not wavered in the face of COVID-19 pandemic. Canada sees IFAD as a key partner in tackling climate change. IFAD has a real comparative advantage in reaching the rural poor, particularly people in remote areas, and working with them to build their resilience to climate change and improve their livelihoods. That's why we continue to be steadfast donor to IFAD's replenishments this year. This year, Canada provided a $150 million concessional loan to IFAD for climate-focused activities, including scaling up climate adaptation best practices. In the intermediate term, we were also one of the first donors to IFAD's rural poor stimulus facility. Canada announced $6 million in rapid funding in June of this year to support the efforts of smallholder farmers to build back better in the face of the pandemic. Raj, I think if anything, this pandemic has shown us how interconnected we all are, and our global food systems depend on smallholder farmers being able to recover from today's shock and become resilient to the future ones.
Thank you very much for that. And you're right, the pandemic has kind of highlighted these issues in stark relief for all of us. I guess as we close out our session today, do you have a call to action that you want to provide to all of us, the broader international development community, other donors like Canada, the global institutions, UN agencies, and others? What do you think we should be taking away from the session we've had today and from this issue when we put smallholder farmers at the center?
Well, Raj, I think Canada, as I mentioned, has committed providing $2.65 billion over 5 years to help developing countries transition to low carbon, climate resilient economies. We are on track to fulfill this commitment by the end of March next year. We've also had success with supporting the installation of renewable energy systems and developing renewable energy markets in developing countries. There is no doubt that globally we need to increase annual climate finance investments every year if we are to transition to a low carbon economy. Moving forward, I know for Canada, we will be fine-tuning how we can be even more effective and inclusive in our approach. As has been mentioned, how do we hit the most marginalized? We talked about women, we talked about those Indigenous communities, we talked about those rural remote areas. That's why Government of Canada held public consultations this past summer to get input from stakeholders and industry on how to deliver Canada's future commitments to climate financing leading up to COP26 in November next year. As part of our commitment, as our commitment comes to an end next year, we are really excited to share the key messages that we've heard. They'll be posted later this fall, and we encourage you to take a look once the findings are posted on the web. Through Canada's feminist international assistance policy, Canada will continue to support women's leadership and decision-making in climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. We will do that by ensuring that our climate-related planning, policy-making, and financing acknowledges the challenges faced by women and girls.
Well, Kamal, thank you very much for bringing that message. And I think it's a great way to close out the session because so much of this is, as we heard from our panelists, and as the report underlines, about the commitment of governments, of international organizations to these issues, to sometimes remembering that the people who are at the very end of this long chain are actually the center. They're actually the core of a big issue like the global climate crisis. So thank you for underlining those commitments that Canada has made. And our thanks at DevEx to our partners at IFAD for doing this event together with us. In fact, I want to make sure everyone is aware this is the second in a series of 3 events that we're hosting together before the end of this year. And the next one, you're very invited to join us. It's on December 17th, and it's a spotlight on nutrition. Nutrition, better resilience. So as you can see, there's a theme here, and we are digging into issues that we think deserve a lot more attention and I think awareness from all of you. So thank you for being a part of this today. There'll be a recording of this event along with some of the other information and data in the report shared afterwards. And really, this wouldn't be possible without all of you who've joined us from around the world. Thank you for your interest and commitment to these issues. Continue to follow us online and follow our coverage and reporting on these issues going forward. And in these very challenging times, I just wish all of you to be well. Thank you.